In the early months of 1942, Diego Suarez was still a quiet name on Allied charts, an inlet at the northern tip of Madagascar, better known to navigators than to soldiers. Its waters lay calm beneath volcanic hills, far from the burning fronts of Europe or the Pacific. Yet as the war widened, that calm began to look deceptive. What had once been a distant colonial harbour was now being reread as a risk. Diego Suarez, known locally as Antsanana, owed its importance to geography rather than industry or population. The harbour cut deep into the land, protected by narrow entrances and ringed by high ground that broke the force of the Indian Ocean. It was one of the few places in the region where a major fleet could anchor, refuel, and remain hidden from the weather. In peacetime, that made it convenient. In wartime, it made it dangerous. For decades, French naval planners had regarded Diego Suarez as a strategic reserve, valuable but rarely central. That assessment changed abruptly in June 1940, when France fell, and the country's overseas territories were forced to choose sides. Madagascar aligned itself with the Vichy government later that year, a decision that preserved French administration but severed coordination with Britain. On paper, the island was neutral in intent. In reality, it became a blind spot. Vichy control did not mean Axis occupation. German or Italian forces never arrived. The harbour's guns remained French-manned, its airfields lightly staffed, its defences modest and incomplete. Yet for the Allies, that distinction mattered less as the war spread. A harbour did not need to be hostile to become a liability. It only needed to be available. Through 1941, the Indian Ocean remained comparatively quiet. British shipping moved between South Africa, the Middle East and India with manageable risk. Diego Suarez sat along those routes like a door left unlocked, not because someone was already inside, but because someone else might notice it. That concern remained theoretical until December, when Japan entered the war and rewrote every calculation east of Suez. Japanese naval power advanced rapidly and with confidence. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 shattered assumptions about distance and security. British naval forces in the region were weakened, scattered, and suddenly defensive. With Japanese carriers operating far beyond expectations, planners in London and Cape Town began asking questions they had avoided before. If Japan sought to disrupt Allied shipping in the Indian Ocean, where would it stage from? And if it found Diego Suarez intact, who would stop it? There was no firm evidence that Japan intended to seize Madagascar. Intelligence at the time offered fragments, not confirmations, rumors of reconnaissance, speculative assessments, worst-case projections. Yet war planning rarely waits for certainty. Allied leaders worried less about proven intent than about opportunity. A deep-water harbour, lightly defended, governed by a regime hostile but not belligerent, this combination felt increasingly intolerable. British fears were sharpened by precedent. In Southeast Asia, bases had fallen not because they were heavily attacked, but because they were poorly secured when the moment came. Diego Suarez, by contrast, was not fortified as a fortress despite later labels. Its coastal artillery was limited, its airfields were underdeveloped, its defenders were capable but isolated, cut off from reinforcements, and operating under instructions shaped more by politics than by strategy. Diplomacy offered little reassurance. Vichy authorities insisted on sovereignty and neutrality while refusing Allied oversight. Any attempt to inspect or occupy the harbour peacefully was rejected. To leave Diego Suarez alone was to accept uncertainty at a moment when uncertainty had already proved costly. Gradually, the language within Allied planning circles shifted from whether action was justified to whether delay itself was reckless. By early 1942, Diego Suarez was no longer judged by what it was, but by what it might become. The harbour's value lay not in French intentions, but in Japanese reach. Control of the Indian Ocean sea lanes to India, the Middle East and Australia was suddenly fragile. One additional threat point could tilt the balance from strain to rupture. The choice confronting the Allies was narrow and uncomfortable. To seize the harbour meant attacking French forces who were not active enemies. To leave it untouched meant accepting a risk that could not be measured until it was too late. There was no option that felt clean. But war, by then, had already made cleanliness a luxury. As planners weighed maps and probabilities, Diego Suarez stopped being a distant anchorage and became a problem demanding resolution. The question was no longer whether it mattered, but how long the Allies could afford to pretend that it did not. No Allied commander welcomed the idea of invading Madagascar. The problem was not strategic ignorance but political weight. To strike Diego Suarez meant opening fire on French troops, men who only 2 years earlier had been allies and who were still not formally enemies. In early 1942, the operation being sketched in London was shaped as much by reluctance as by resolve. The question first surfaced quietly, in staff papers and contingency discussions that avoided definitive language. Diego Suarez was described not as a target, but as a vulnerability. The objective was not conquest, but denial, preventing the harbour's use by any power hostile to Allied shipping. That distinction mattered, because it framed everything that followed. This was to be a limited operation, confined in scope and purpose, designed to close a door rather than open a new front. Political hesitation ran deep. Britain had already fought French forces once before, at Mers el-Kebir in 1940, an episode that left bitterness on both sides. Another clash risked reinforcing the perception that the Allies were at war with France itself, rather than with Axis power. In Washington, where American support was growing but still cautious, there was concern that such an operation could complicate relations with Vichy at a delicate moment, yet hesitation did not erase urgency. By early 1942, Allied naval strength in the Indian Ocean was thin. The Royal Navy had suffered losses in the Far East, and its remaining capital ships were stretched across enormous distances. Shipping routes carrying oil, troops, and food to India and the Middle East had little margin for disruption. Planners understood that they could not defend every mile of ocean, but they could remove obvious points of leverage. Intelligence shaped the discussion, but only imperfectly. Reports on Madagascar were uneven, drawn from pre-war surveys, scattered reconnaissance, and second-hand assessments. The strength of Vichy defences was uncertain. Some estimates suggested determined resistance, others pointed to shortages, poor morale, and limited readiness. No one could say with confidence how French forces on the island would respond if attacked. That uncertainty encouraged caution, but it also discouraged delay. The choice of Diego Suarez, rather than the entire island, reflected both pragmatism and restraint. A full occupation of Madagascar would require manpower the Allies did not have to spare in early 1942. North Africa loomed as a future priority. India demanded reinforcement. The Pacific was consuming American resources at a staggering pace. What could be spared was enough to seize one harbour, not an island the size of France. Amphibious warfare itself posed another challenge. The British had not conducted a major opposed landing since Norway in 1940, a campaign remembered more for its failures than its lessons. There was no established doctrine to rely on, only evolving ideas shaped by trial and error. Naval gunfire, air support, and coordination between sea and land forces all remained works in progress. Diego Suarez would test these systems under real conditions. Secrecy became essential. The operation, soon given the codename Ironclad, was deliberately narrow in its stated aims. Its planning avoided publicity, and even within Allied circles, knowledge was compartmentalized. The fewer assumptions made, the better. If the landings succeeded quickly, political damage might be contained. If they failed, the consequences would be harder to disguise. Command responsibilities were defined with care. Naval forces were placed under Admiral Sir Edward Sifrit, a veteran officer tasked not with seeking battle, but with delivering troops safely and maintaining control of the sea. Land forces were assigned to Major General Robert Sturges, whose instructions emphasized speed and restraint rather than decisive annihilation. The objective was Diego Suarez, not glory, not punishment. Throughout the planning process, uncertainty lingered. Would Vichy forces fight? Would local commanders negotiate? Would the harbour's defences hold longer than expected? And perhaps most unsettling of all, was the operation already late? If Japanese forces were already probing the Indian Ocean, would seizing Diego Suarez solve a future problem or merely confirm that it had existed all along? These doubts shaped Ironclad's final form. The landings were to avoid unnecessary destruction. Naval bombardment would be limited, not only to preserve infrastructure but to avoid provoking wider escalation. Air support would be available, but sparingly used. Everything about the plan reflected a desire to control outcomes in a war that had repeatedly punished overconfidence. By late April 1942, the fleet assembled in silence. Transports carried troops whose orders were precise but incomplete. Many knew where they were going, but not what awaited them. Maps were studied, timetables rehearsed, yet beneath the discipline ran an awareness that this was an operation built on assumptions rather than certainties. As the ships turned north toward Madagascar, Ironclad remained what it had always been, an invasion designed to solve a problem no one wanted to acknowledge openly. The harbour at Diego Suarez lay ahead, still French, still intact, and still unresolved. The moment for decision had passed. Now, only execution remained. In the hours before dawn on the 5th of May 1942, Allied ships lay off the northern coast of Madagascar with their lights darkened and their radios silent. There had been no declaration of war, no ultimatum delivered in the night. The troops aboard knew they were approaching French territory, but not whether they would be met with resistance or confusion. Ironclad was about to cross a line that diplomacy had failed to resolve. The chosen landing sites lay north and west of Diego Suarez, selected for their distance from the harbour's main defences rather than their comfort. The coastline was uneven, cut by mangrove swamps, narrow beaches, and rough ground that resisted easy movement. This was not terrain designed for rapid assault. It was terrain chosen to avoid immediate confrontation, trading speed for surprise. The landings began under cover of darkness. Small craft moved toward shore, carrying British and Commonwealth troops who had trained for weeks without knowing whether their arrival would be contested. There was no preparatory naval bombardment. That omission was deliberate. Commanders hoped that Restraint might reduce resistance, preserve the harbour's facilities, and signal that this was a limited action, not an act of annihilation. On shore, the first encounters were disorienting rather than violent. French sentries were present, but often unprepared. Some posts were bypassed entirely, others offered brief resistance before falling silent. Communication among Vichy forces was uneven. Orders had been issued to defend the territory, but without clarity on how forcefully that defense should be pressed. The result was fragmentation rather than cohesion. Terrain quickly became the greater obstacle. Roads were few and poorly surfaced. Vehicles bogged down. Units that were meant to advance in parallel lost contact with one another as they pushed inland. Progress depended on clearing paths through scrub and jungle that slowed movement and strained coordination. The risk was not that the landings would fail outright, but that momentum would dissolve before objectives were secured. Despite these difficulties, the absence of heavy resistance allowed Allied forces to adapt. Engineers worked to improve tracks. Patrols probed ahead cautiously. Where French units did engage, the encounters were sharp but localized. Neither side appeared eager for escalation. For the defenders, the sudden appearance of an invasion force raised questions of authority and intent. For the attackers, each skirmish carried the political weight of fighting former allies. One of Ironclad's priorities was the neutralization of coastal batteries guarding the approaches to Diego Suarez. These positions, though limited in number and caliber, posed a potential threat to naval movements if left intact. Moving against them required careful balance, enough force to secure compliance, but not enough to damage the harbour that was the operation's true objective. As daylight spread across the northern tip of Madagascar, the shape of the operation began to emerge. Allied troops had gained a foothold. Key routes were being contested or secured. Yet Diego Suarez itself remained out of reach, its entrance still controlled by French guns and watched by defenders uncertain of what orders they were expected to follow. The operation had achieved surprise, but not resolution. Within Vichy command structures, confusion deepened. Local officers faced a dilemma: resist and risk destruction, or negotiate without clear authorization from higher authority. Governor-General Armand Léon Annette, responsible for the island as a whole, was not present at Diego Suarez, and communication with him was slow. Decisions that might normally require days were now demanded in hours. For Allied commanders, restraint remained policy, but impatience crept in. Every delay increased the chance of reinforcement, miscalculation, or external intervention. The harbour was the prize, but it could not be taken intact unless pressure was applied carefully. The absence of heavy fighting did not reduce tension, it sharpened it. Both sides were waiting for the other to decide how far this confrontation would go. By the end of the 5th of May, Ironclad stood at an uneasy midpoint. The landings had succeeded without catastrophe. Coastal defences were being isolated, yet the harbour itself was still contested space, neither fully defended nor fully surrendered. The French garrison had not collapsed, but it had not unified either. What lay ahead was not a decisive clash, but a narrowing of options. As night returned, both sides took stock. Allied troops consolidated their positions, aware that speed had brought them this far, but caution would shape what followed. French commanders weighed orders written for a different kind of war against the reality unfolding around them. Diego Suarez remained just beyond reach, its fate unresolved. The invasion had begun without a declaration, without spectacle, and without certainty. What it had created was pressure, political, military, and psychological, tightening around a harbour that could no longer remain neutral. The next step would determine whether Ironclad ended as a controlled seizure or as something far harder to contain. By the morning of the 6th of May 1942, the question at Diego Suarez was no longer whether the Allies could reach the harbour, but how the French defenders would respond when they did. The term fortress had long been attached to the port, yet as Allied forces moved closer, its limits became clearer. Diego Suarez was strong by geography, not by preparation. The advance toward Antsanana unfolded with measured urgency. Allied units pressed forward along the few usable roads, linking their dispersed landing forces into a more coherent front. Resistance appeared in pockets rather than lines. Some French positions fought briefly before withdrawing, others waited, uncertain whether to engage at all. The absence of a unified defensive plan became increasingly evident. Vichy forces at Diego Suarez were not insignificant, nor were they uniformly unwilling to fight. Coastal batteries still guarded the harbour entrance, and inland positions overlooked key approaches. Yet shortages of modern equipment, limited air support, and unclear chains of command constrained their options. Orders to defend the territory clashed with an understanding that overwhelming force now stood offshore and inland. As pressure mounted, Allied commanders continued to avoid unnecessary destruction. Naval installations, fuel stores, and port facilities were the operation's true objectives, and preserving them shaped every decision. Where possible, French positions were isolated rather than assaulted. Negotiation, even under fire, remained part of the calculus. The turning point came as Allied troops gained the high ground dominating the harbour. Control of these positions shifted the balance decisively. Artillery observation points and access routes fell under Allied oversight, reducing the defenders' ability to contest the port effectively. The harbour itself, once protected by distance and uncertainty, was now exposed. Within the French command, the reality of isolation set in. Reinforcements were not coming. Air support was minimal. Governor-General Annett, still coordinating from elsewhere on the island, faced a deteriorating situation he could not reverse quickly. Local commanders weighed the cost of continued resistance against the likelihood that it would change nothing. On the 7th of May 1942, negotiations began in earnest. They were shaped less by ideology than by pragmatism. The French sought to preserve honor, limit casualties, and protect infrastructure. The Allies aimed to secure the harbour intact and avoid prolonging a politically sensitive fight. The result was not an unconditional collapse, but a managed surrender. Diego Suarez fell with less violence than many had feared. The harbour was secured. Naval facilities passed into Allied control, largely undamaged. The fortress, such as it was, had been neutralized in days rather than weeks. Yet the speed of success carried its own unease. The operation had achieved its immediate objective, but not closure. French forces elsewhere on Madagascar remained under Vichy authority. Governor-General Annett did not capitulate for the entire island. Diego Suarez was now an Allied-held enclave, surrounded by territory that was still politically and militarily uncertain. The operation's limited scope, once its virtue, now revealed its constraints. For Allied planners, the harbor's capture answered one question, while raising others. Had Ironclad resolved the threat, or merely shifted it? Control of Diego Suarez denied its use to potential adversaries, but it did not erase the wider instability of the region. The Indian Ocean remained contested, and events beyond Madagascar were moving quickly. As Allied ships entered the harbor they had come to secure, attention turned to consolidation rather than celebration. Defenses were reorganized, facilities assessed. The assumption was that the danger had been removed, or at least reduced to a manageable level. Yet beneath that assumption lingered a doubt shaped by recent experience. Wars rarely punish caution, but they often punish certainty. Diego Suarez had fallen faster than its planners expected. But the war had already taught hard lessons about what comes after apparent success. The harbor was in Allied hands, but the forces that had made it valuable in the first place were still active, still probing, and still capable of surprise. For more than 3 weeks after Diego Suarez fell, the harbor settled into a rhythm that suggested resolution. Allied ships lay at anchor in waters now considered secure. The port's facilities were inspected, repaired where necessary, and folded into the wider system of Indian Ocean defense. Ironclad appeared to have done what it was designed to do, remove uncertainty by force, and then move on. That sense of closure was illusory. On the night of the 30th of May 1942, long after the fighting ashore had ended, the harbor was struck from below. 2 Japanese Type A midget submarines, launched from larger vessels operating at extreme range, penetrated the approaches to Diego Suarez. Their presence alone was startling. No one had expected Japanese submarines, let alone midget craft, to appear so far west, so soon after the harbor's capture. The attack unfolded quietly and with precision. One of the midget submarines managed to slip through the harbor defenses and fired torpedoes at Allied ships at anchor. A British tanker, serving as an escort and support vessel, was hit and later sank. The battleship HMS Ramillies was damaged, though not sunk, forcing her temporary withdrawal for repairs. The physical damage was limited, but the psychological effect was profound. For Allied commanders, the implications were immediate and unsettling. The very scenario Ironclad had been designed to prevent a Japanese naval presence exploiting Diego Suarez had not been imagined so soon, or in this form. The harbor had been secured, yet it had still been reached. The distinction between occupation and control suddenly felt thinner than expected. The midget submarines themselves did not escape. One ran aground after its attack. Its crew was later killed in a confrontation ashore. The other failed to return to its parent submarine. From a purely tactical perspective, the raid was costly for Japan and limited in outcome. Strategically, however, it confirmed something Allied planners had feared but could not prove. The Japanese naval reach into the Indian Ocean was real and adaptable. Reports in the days that followed struggled to interpret the attack's meaning. Some assessments argued that the raid proved Ironclad had been justified, that without Allied control, Diego Suarez might have been used more extensively. Others noted the uncomfortable counterpoint. The harbor had been struck even after capture. If the operation had come weeks later, the consequences might have been worse, but it was equally clear that seizing the port had not made it immune. The episode also reframed earlier intelligence debates. Pre-invasion concerns about Japanese interest in Madagascar had often been dismissed as speculative. Now, speculation had materialized in steel and torpedoes. Whether Japan had planned a sustained presence or merely a demonstration remained unclear. What mattered was that opportunity, once feared, had become action. Within Allied command, confidence gave way to recalibration. Harbor defenses were strengthened, anti-submarine measures were expanded. The assumption that Diego Suarez was now a rear-area anchorage was quietly discarded. It remained valuable, but it was no longer comfortable. Control of geography did not guarantee control of the sea. Politically, the attack sharpened arguments about Madagascar's future. A limited seizure of one harbor now seemed insufficient against a mobile, unpredictable enemy. If Japanese forces could reach Diego Suarez even once, they might do so again, or exploit other points along the island's vast coastline. Ironclad, conceived as a contained solution, began to look like a first step rather than a conclusion. The irony was difficult to miss. The harbour had been taken to prevent a hypothetical threat, only to be attacked in reality after the fact. Yet that irony did not invalidate the operation. Instead, it clarified its place within a larger pattern of wartime decision-making, where action is judged not by certainty, but by what it makes less likely. As repairs were made and defenses tightened, Diego Suarez assumed a new identity. It was no longer just a harbour denied to the enemy. It was now a forward position, exposed and alert, reminding its occupiers that the Indian Ocean was no longer a quiet backwater of the war. Ironclad had solved one problem, but in doing so it revealed how many others still lay beneath the surface. After the attack of the 30th of May, Diego Suarez no longer felt like a completed operation. The harbour was secure in the narrow sense, occupied, defended, functioning, but the wider situation remained unresolved. Ironclad had closed one door, while leaving many others ajar. What followed was not a return to normality, but a prolonged period of uncertainty shaped by limits the planners had always known existed. French authority on Madagascar had not collapsed with the fall of Diego Suarez. Governor-General Armand Léon Arnett remained in control of the rest of the island, commanding forces that were still intact and still loyal to Vichy. Communications between Allied commanders and French officials were formal, cautious and strained. There was no immediate surrender, no clear political settlement to match the military success at the harbour. For the Allies, this created an awkward reality. Diego Suarez had been seized to deny its use to Japan, not to govern Madagascar. Yet holding the harbour required supply lines, manpower, and constant vigilance. Every battalion assigned to garrison duty was a battalion unavailable elsewhere. In mid-1942, that trade-off mattered. North Africa was looming larger in Allied planning. The Middle East demanded reinforcement. Resources were finite. The dilemma was straightforward, but its implications were not. To hold Diego Suarez alone risked turning it into an isolated outpost, secure in itself, but surrounded by uncertainty. To expand operations across Madagascar would require a political decision to escalate against the Vichy authorities, with all the diplomatic consequences that would entail. Neither option was fully satisfactory. Civil administration added another layer of complexity. The port functioned because local labor continued to work, often under ambiguous authority. French civil officials remained in place, operating alongside Allied military control. This arrangement preserved order, but it also reflected the unresolved nature of the occupation. Diego Suarez was neither fully liberated nor fully subdued. It existed in a provisional state, governed by necessity rather than clarity. From London and Washington, assessments continued to evolve. The Japanese submarine raid had underscored the island's strategic relevance, but it had also highlighted how limited Ironclad's original objectives were. Control of one harbour reduced risk, but it did not eliminate it. As Japanese naval activity persisted across the Indian Ocean, the question returned with renewed force. Was partial control enough? By mid-1942, the answer increasingly appeared to be no. Allied planners began to accept that Madagascar could not remain divided indefinitely. As long as large portions of the island were under Vichy control, uncertainty would persist about intelligence, logistics, and the potential for further external intervention. The logic that had justified Ironclad now pointed beyond it. At the same time, Allied commanders remained cautious. Any expansion would need to be measured, timed to avoid overstretch, and coordinated with broader strategic priorities. The war was entering a phase where Allied resources were growing, but not yet abundant. Decisions about Madagascar had to compete with decisions about North Africa, the Atlantic, and the Pacific. For the French forces on the island, the situation was equally uncomfortable. Cut off from meaningful support, aware of shifting tides, and facing an enemy that was no longer tentative, their position weakened over time. Yet inertia held. Authority persisted because no decisive moment had yet forced its collapse. Diego Suarez, meanwhile, settled into its role as a guarded asset rather than a triumphant prize. Anti-submarine patrols became routine. Defensive works expanded. The harbour's value lay not in activity, but in denial, ensuring that it remained unavailable to any power that might exploit it. That task required patience rather than momentum. Ironclad had never promised resolution. It had promised control under constraint. By mid-1942, those constraints were becoming harder to ignore. The operation's success had bought time, but time itself demanded decisions. Madagascar could not remain half-secured indefinitely. As planners weighed their options, Diego Suarez stood as both achievement and reminder. It had demonstrated what limited force could accomplish and what it could not. The island's fate was still unsettled, and the war beyond it was still unfolding. The final meaning of Ironclad would depend not on the harbour it seized, but on how the Allies chose to act once its limits were clear. In retrospect, the capture of Diego Suarez can appear deceptively neat, a short operation with a clear objective and a defined outcome, yet its true significance lay not in what was seized, but in how that seizure reshaped Allied thinking at a moment of strategic uncertainty. Ironclad was never meant to dominate headlines, it was meant to remove a question mark from the map. The immediate effect was reassurance. With Diego Suarez under Allied control, one of the most capable harbours in the Western Indian Ocean was denied to any hostile power. Shipping routes linking South Africa to the Middle East and India became marginally safer, not immune to attack, but less exposed to sudden disruption from a forward base. In a theatre defined by distance and scarcity, even modest reductions in risk carried weight. The operation also delivered a quieter lesson about amphibious warfare. Ironclad fell between two better-known episodes, Norway in 1940 and North Africa later in 1942, and it absorbed the caution of the first while foreshadowing the confidence of the second. Planning was restrained, objectives limited, and force applied selectively. Success came not from overwhelming firepower, but from sequencing, surprise, and control of terrain. Those lessons would echo in later Allied debates, even if Diego Suarez itself rarely appeared in them. Politically, the operation forced a recalibration of relations with French authorities. Ironclad demonstrated that Allied patience had limits, but it also showed a preference for containment over humiliation. French forces were confronted, not annihilated. Administration was disrupted, not erased. This balance, awkward, provisional, and imperfect, reflected the larger Allied struggle to navigate a war in which legitimacy mattered almost as much as territory. Yet just as important were the limits Ironclad exposed. The seizure of Diego Suarez did not end Japanese naval activity in the Indian Ocean. It did not remove the need for escorts, patrols, and vigilance across thousands of miles of sea. The midget submarine attack had already made that clear. Control of a harbour could reduce danger, but it could not abolish it. Nor did Ironclad offer a blueprint in the strict sense. Later, amphibious operations would differ in scale, doctrine, and ambition. What Diego Suarez provided was not a model to be copied, but a proof of concept that limited, politically sensitive landings could succeed if they matched means to ends. Its influence was indirect, absorbed into planning cultures rather than formal doctrine. As the war moved on, Madagascar itself faded from the center of Allied attention. Larger battles, larger landings, and larger stakes soon dominated the narrative. When the island was fully occupied later in 1942, it happened without the urgency or symbolism that had driven Ironclad. The decisive moment had already passed, quietly, in May. This fading from memory was not accidental. Ironclad lacked the drama of desperation or triumph. It was a preventive action, judged more by what did not happen than by what did. No Japanese fleet sailed from Diego Suarez. No major convoy was lost because the harbour lay open. The operation's success was measured in absences, not victories. Yet those absences mattered. In a war shaped by cascading risks, reducing uncertainty could be as valuable as winning battles. Diego Suarez represented a point where the Allies chose action over hesitation, not because certainty demanded it, but because delay had become more dangerous than consequence. In that sense, Ironclad was less about seizing ground than about reclaiming initiative. It acknowledged that war in 1942 no longer allowed for neutral spaces shaped by hope or assumption. Geography itself had become contested, and leaving a strategic harbour unresolved was a risk the Allies could no longer accept. Diego Suarez never became a symbol of conquest, and it was never intended to. Its role was quieter, more restrained, and more revealing. It showed how global war forced decisions in unlikely places, and how those decisions were often made not with confidence but with caution, sharpened by experience. When the harbour slipped back into obscurity after the war, it did so having fulfilled its purpose, not as a fortress gloriously taken, but as a problem confronted, contained and absorbed into the wider flow of events. In a conflict defined by vast movements and brutal certainties, Diego Suarez stands as a reminder that some of the war's most consequential choices were made far from the front, where uncertainty itself became the enemy. This story shows how quiet decisions shaped a global war, long before the headlines caught up. Like the video, share it with someone who values the hidden mechanics of WY, and subscribe for more WW2 tales. Your support keeps these overlooked chapters alive and explored.